It's very clear what the Republican Party is up to. They are trying to make it harder for some people to vote and easier to cheat. We're trying to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. I'm the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. And I take great umbrage when members of this body would use old, trite states' rights arguments, the same kinds of states' rights arguments that were used against Dr. King back then, to push against reasonable access to the ballot right now. And many of these same politicians will stand up in just a few days and they will give lip service to Martin Luther King Jr. Well, you cannot remember Dr. King and dismember his legacy at the same time. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, is the legacy of Dr. King, and if you would give lip service to his name, you need to find yourself on the right side of history, pushing to get these bills done. And so I urge my colleagues to do the right thing. If those on the other side refuse to do it, the Democrats will have to act alone. But by all means, we have to act. Dr. King's words are as true now as they were back then. Justice delayed is justice denied. Time is running out. Let's get the job done.
I'm Sarah Kenzier, the author of the bestsellers The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight, and of the upcoming book They Knew, out this September.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world.
Our opening clip was Senator Raphael Warnock calling out the Jim Crow filibuster protected by Koch dark money darling Kyrsten Sinema, who we'll get to later in this show. We need to keep Senator Warnock in the Senate. He is up for re-election this year. If you're angry, channel that rage into making a much-needed donation. Any amount can make a difference to Senator Warnock's re-election campaign, and get yourself ready to help get out the vote this year. We're going to follow Stacey Abrams' lead and fight like hell to protect our democracy and keep the fascists on the ropes. This week's Gaslit Nation early show, available for listeners at the Truth Teller level and higher on Patreon, is the Ask Us Anything Q&A, where Sarah and I literally answer any and all questions. So if you've ever wanted to vent, get something off your chest, or bring anything to our attention, this is the place to do it. Come join our community and get in on the Gaslit Nation support group as we hold the line together to ensure a democracy for our children. Today's opening segment is called Seditious Conspiracy. As you may recall, in last week's episode, we played a clip of Lawrence Tribe, Merrick Garland's former Harvard Law School professor who taught the United States Attorney General constitutional law. In the clip, Tribe called on his former student to bring charges of seditious conspiracy. And that is what Garland has done against Stewart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, a dangerous far-right militia made up of white supremacists, many former or current law enforcement or military. They also run for office and are actively involved in their local elections. In addition to Rhodes, who did not enter the Capitol on January 6th but was stationed outside, 10 other Oath Keepers were also charged with seditious conspiracy. You may remember the Oath Keepers as the column of militiamen who calmingly worked their way up the steps of the U.S. Capitol through the growing crowd. The charges show there were several experienced groups that showed up to the Capitol on January 6th prepared for war. They held reconnaissance missions several months in advance. They engaged in logistical planning, like getting weapons and bringing the weapons to the Capitol. They regularly discussed fighting, preparing for an op, and going to war. They stockpiled weapons in a hotel in Virginia in case of an all-out battle in our nation's capital. When their January 6th operation failed, they stockpiled even more weapons, including $17,500 worth of weapons at the Oath Keepers leader's home. That's again Stuart Rhodes, with plans of disrupting the inauguration on January 20, as we had warned on this show. Okay, we warned that the inauguration was vulnerable. We warned there's going to be more violence. And they kept chatting among themselves about what they referred to as Civil War 2.0. CNN reports that several months ago, Garland had initially balked at the seditious conspiracy charges. That's the word CNN uses, balked. In the months since, federal prosecutors worked hard to strengthen the case, working with cooperators and internal communication between the Oath Keepers. To be fair to Garland, and we can discuss this later, Sarah, if you feel differently, which you may, but to be fair to Garland, a longtime judge, seditious conspiracy charges are extremely rare and difficult to prove. So the original balking could, of course, be read as needing more to ensure a slam dunk conviction. This turning point confirms the insurrection was indeed an insurrection, like we needed that confirmation. In his January 5th, 2022 address to the nation, Garland said the DOJ would go after people at any level. The big question remains, will the founder of the Oath Keepers be as high as the DOJ will go? Stuart Rhodes, the founder, has lived his life escaping consequences. He's a Yale Law School graduate, another privileged white man who knows how to skirt the law. Here is his estranged wife, Tasha Adams, who told CNN she spent years fearing for her life and for her children, calling Rhodes a dangerous man to her personally and to the country, who has managed to escape accountability. As you listen to this, keep Trump and his goon squad in mind.
He's a dangerous man. He is very dangerous. He lives very much in his own head. He sees himself as a great leader. He almost has his own mythology of himself. And I think he almost made it come true, as seeing himself as some sort of figure in history. And it sort of happened. He's a complete sociopath. He does not feel empathy for anyone around him at all. And yeah.
Now, I understand you've been talking to the January 6th Select Committee, so you've been involved in the various investigations here. You say he is dangerous to the country, a dangerous man. What is it specifically you think he did in the events surrounding January 6th?
I think he planned it very carefully. I think he planned for himself to not get arrested by seemingly to stay out of the Capitol himself. But that entire stack, the people that went in, the entire event, I see his fingerprints all over it. And I think even though from the outside, I told them not to go in, we were just there for to guard people. It's silly, but it's also very carefully planned to keep himself out of trouble. And it's what he did on small scale. In our own family. I wasn't even able to get a restraining order. It was denied because he seemed like such a great guy to the judge. And that's just how he's always been. And there's a lot of vindication there, seeing him finally having to answer to some type of consequence probably for the first time in his entire life.
The Oath Keepers provided private security to longtime Trump friend and master of the dark arts of stealing elections with the help of the Kremlin, Roger Stone. Garland promised he would go high up. Rhodes cannot be the biggest fish. They must also indict Trump, Stone, Giuliani, Bannon, and a long list of others who, like Rhodes, incited violence, centrally planned in plain sight, and tried to appear clean by not breaking into the Capitol. Rhodes' strategy to remain clean and deny any wrongdoing is a lot like the strategy of Trump and his inner circle, like the Kremlin clown car holed up in the Willard Hotel war room, where they plotted for several days in advance of their January 6th coup on how to overthrow our democracy. Speaking of Trump, the ringleader of the seditious conspiracy held a Nazi rally in Arizona calling for racial violence, essentially. Remember, genocides start with hate speech and propaganda. That's the warning of my film, Mr. Jones. Trump is focusing his Nazi minions on overtaking local elections that certify the vote, using dangerous rhetoric to justify any means necessary to come to power and stay in power. This is his election stealing strategy for 2024, either to steal the presidency for himself or a posh Trump who will drop any investigations into him, his family, and his goon squad. So whether he runs or not, Trump remains a major threat in the 2024 election. I want to be clear, Trump can be put away now based on the Mueller report. Garland should stop waiting out the clock. It's a dangerous dereliction of duty that continues to hurt Biden's approval rating among his own supporters who breathlessly follow the Mueller investigation and its explosive findings. Here's a news clip from way back when, 2019, confirming Mueller built a case that allows prosecutors to charge Trump once he left office.
Now, one of the most interesting parts of the testimony today, Mueller admitting why charging the president was never considered, while also admitting he believes Trump could be charged after he leaves office. That revelation actually coming surprisingly during a question with Colorado Republican Congressman Ken Buck, who also serves as chairman of the state GOP.
Was there sufficient evidence to convict President Trump or anyone else with obstruction of justice?
We did not make that calculation.
How could you not have made the calculation with the regulation?
The OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel, indicates that we cannot indict a sitting president.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
Trump has been walking around free for a year, inciting a growing war against our democracy as the leader of a seditious conspiracy. The longer Garland waits, the more dangerous the crisis for our country, and Biden's approval rating will continue to pay the price, hurting Democrats in the 2022 midterms and giving the far-right Republicans an easier shot of taking over Congress, which will allow them to further consolidate power and stay in power in 2024 and beyond. Once again, Garland needs to go after Trump now for the charges outlined in the Mueller report, and he has everything he needs right now to indict Trump.
Yeah, and he's had it the whole time. I mean, one of the frustrating things about discussing, the Capitol attack and especially the broader coup and coup attempt, that precipitated it, where Trump tried to go through the courts, forged documents, threatened public officials, used along with Stone many of the tactics that they had planned back in 2016 when Stone first coined the Stop the Steal slogan. Like, this is a strategy that they've had for 5 years. They had plenty of time to do that. But when people discuss it today, and this is, I think the fault of the cable news media system, and then it's reiterated on social media, they frame it as keeping score. They frame it as a matter of vengeance, whereas this is just about basic public safety, about our sovereignty, about the preservation of our democracy, about an end to elite criminal impunity. The reason that Andrea and I speak about repercussions for the January 6th attackers, especially the elite operatives at the top, is because they are planning a sequel and they hold enormous wealth and power. And they need to be stopped right now from using that enormous wealth and power and this vast criminal network and all of the state secrets and intelligence that they gained during Trump's time in office and that they had beforehand to help get Trump into office. They are going to use that to hurt this country irreparably. Like, if they take over in 2024, there's a number of very bad outcomes, that could emerge, ranging from autocracy to civil war to partitioning, and there's also the possibility that we get past this, that we have accountability, that we have an actual, attack on transnational organized crime, that all of this comes out in the open. These decades of crimes and cover-ups. That's what we were hoping for in 2020, because the urgency of that was so obvious, given the toll of the pandemic, given the attack on the Capitol. We did not think that we would have to be in a position to convince the Attorney General of the United States, to convince the Democratic Party, which had just been under physical assault by insurrectionists, that these individuals needed to be public before they acted again. It should be obvious. A loyal public servant, a patriot, does not need to be convinced to protect their own country. They want to, out of love for America, out of concern for its future. And Merrick Garland does not feel that way. He has to be dragged by the public to do the most rudimentary actions. And it's not just people like Andrea and I commenting from the sidelines. It's his own professors. It's people like Lawrence Tribe, Andrea mentioned before. It's former members of the DOJ. They've been issuing public letters to Merrick Garland. Their most recent one, was in January 2022, right after his speech. And, this is a mass signed letter, from hundreds of former DOJ staffers. We'll put a link in the show notes. You'll probably recognize quite a lot of the names. I'm going to read a small part of it. While the Attorney General rightly counseled patience as the department moves the investigation toward higher level actors, we urge him to preserve the public trust by holding culpable leaders to account as soon as possible. Note that, as soon as possible. His speech appropriately recognizes that if those who hold the most power are allowed to act with impunity, while the less powerful are sent to prison, equal justice under the law would be a lie, and respect for the rule of law and democracy itself would be in grave danger of destruction. For all these reasons, we call on the Attorney General to continue to translate his important words into concrete actions to impose accountability on the powerful people who sought to destroy our democracy, in every case supported by the evidence. So this is a, politely worded letter. They're sharing their support for Merrick Garland, their support for the DOJ, an institution at which they once worked, but they recognize the urgency and the immediacy of this crisis. I mean, I think basically everyone does, except for, unfortunately, the people who are in charge of managing it, as well as the majority of pundits, because the crisis has unfolded in plain sight and the perpetrators routinely confessed. And this is also true of the Oath Keepers. Like, Merrick Garland may think it takes 8 months to find the evidence and bring a case, even though, others at the DOJ felt differently. And I'm trying to figure out why exactly it takes so long to find this information when they literally post it on the internet. And here's one example. This is about an Oath Keeper. I'm going to read a tweet from Ben Collins, who's a reporter for NBC, who's been following the Oath Keepers and QAnon and all of these fringe militant groups very closely. And so he writes, "If I were an Oath Keeper about to storm the Capitol, I would not have posted, quote, 'Here is a link to a web-based chat, uses AES 256 encrypted database, could be useful for January 6th communications,' under the name, quote, 'Oath Keeper for Life' on the web forum The Donald," this is a Reddit forum, "before posting my hotel room." Like, that is how obvious all of this is. And I watched this on Twitter, as I've mentioned many times. Lynn Wood was recruiting these people, giving them hotel information. There were people out there offering to pay for them to come and storm the Capitol. Like, this was a top-down insurrection. This was not like the masses rising up. And this is so true of Trump's rallies, where we know that they send out advertisements to try to get people in the crowd to, chant certain slogans or, carry out certain kind of activity or have certain kind of public reactions. Like, yes, of course, Trump has actual supporters. And yes, of course, some of those supporters, are militants, are dangerous, etc. But a lot of this is more reality TV from the master of the form. Like, Trump was reality TV before it existed. He carried out this media manipulation, this incredible false public persona, which used scandal to bury crime in the New York tabloids before going to reality TV under Mark Burnett, who incidentally wanted his first show to be about Putin and then chose Trump. But that's another story. It's in my book, Hiding in Plain Sight. And then he switched to social media. Like, this is somebody who understands spectacle exceptionally well and knows how to weaponize spectacle. And the one downside of that for him, the one vulnerability is that when you have a public spectacle that you're trying to hide behind, you're trying to hide, your very sophisticated criminal network behind it, you still end up with evidence like this from Oathkeeper for Life all over the internet. And it becomes really hard for public officials to feign shock. And as I've said many times, they feign shock to avoid accountability. You can't do that with January 6th because the evidence was all over the internet in the run-up to the event. The event itself was on national television. And so all they've been left to do, both the Trump camp and the Democrats, is to try to erode collective memory. And they've done this through a variety of ways. The tweets which had this information are gone. I mean, most of them are archived by people who have been studying this event, but they're not immediately there. So when Trump or somebody else lies, or even when a Democratic official lies and says, oh, we never could have seen this coming, etc., what we used to be able to do was instantly bring up a tweet that shows otherwise, a time-stamped, chronologically vetted tweet that shows exactly who knows what and when. That is gone. Paywalls have also contributed to that year-long erosion of collective memory. And so we're in this position where people are doubting their own mind, and then the lack of accountability from the government prompts them to doubt it further. They start to say, oh, well, if this was really a big deal, there would be arrests. People would act with a sense of urgency. Like, people's hair would be on fire. Like, it would look like it did the day after January 6th, where if you look at the newspaper headlines for that day across the country, doesn't matter, what the political predilection of the state that, printed these headlines are, everyone saw this as an attack. Everyone saw this as an extreme danger. Everyone understood that the perpetrators needed to be, held accountable immediately, or at least contained immediately so that they don't act again. And Ben Collins, whose tweet I just read, who studies the Oathkeeper, notes about the individual who he quoted, this guy's last post was 8 days ago. So he's just been walking around for a year. Now think about that, like multiply that times thousands of people, because that is what you are dealing with. You're dealing with a mass militant movement that is not being stopped. You are dealing with transnational organized crime that is not being stopped. You are dealing with deep, deep institutional rot, the aftermath of the purges and the packing of positions with lackeys that Trump put in place, but also, the rotten and corrupt actors that were in these roles beforehand. Because as I've said, this goes back decades, and Trump couldn't have gotten into power without a serious layer of existing rot, without enablers already in place within these institutions. And instead of clearing out those enablers and those bad actors, Garland seems to be beholden to them. And I'm hoping that this public pressure, which seems to have led to this Oathkeeper leader, Stuart Rhodes, being arrested and others being arrested as well, continues to work, because we are very, very much running out of time here. We're running out of time starting on January 7th, 2021. Like, we never had the time to wait. And every day that goes by without serious action regarding Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, Trump, and his crime cohort, it's more and more dangerous, especially with Trump reemerging, feeling, incredibly emboldened into the public sphere, having a speech that is more overt than I think almost any he's given in his desire for a Charlie Manson style race war. which is what he wants. He wants that violence ratcheted up. He wants it to be blatant. He is no longer telling people to stand by. He is trying to facilitate that level of violence right now. And people should be alarmed, especially when, as Andrea has repeatedly mentioned, Garland could indict him right now on the Mueller report charges for obstruction of justice alone and contain this menace, contain this threat to the American public that we absolutely do not deserve. And he is choosing not to.
The good news is that this administration has shown a lot of signs of responding to public pressure. So that's good. I mean, even Garland's defensive speech on January 5th sounded like he was more talking to Twitter.
But that's weird, man.
So I think it's important. It's super important, and it's our civic duty to speak truth to power and to put pressure on our elected officials, because grassroots power is the most reliable power we have left. And by raising our voices for demanding justice and accountability and protection and the rule of law, that's leadership. If we do not do that, we're abdicating our leadership. So just ignore the troll bot farms, ignore the cults of personality, and speak your truth, stand in your truth, and raise a chorus of voices demanding that we strengthen our democracy. Because if we don't, it's an existential crisis. Lives are at risk. When these far-right fascists come to power, and that's no longer a hysterical statement to call them far-right fascists. That would have been years ago when Sarah and I first started out together. But now it's pretty run-of-the-mill. But when they do come to power, it's game over. We're going to lose generations of time battling the climate crisis and the mass displacement that's going to come with it. And we can't afford that. So when I talk to activists, human rights activists from Russia, they look at America as a democratic paradise compared to what they have to work with. So never, ever, ever, ever take for granted the many levers of power we still very much have and own and control. So own those, own your power. And remember, it's up to us now to protect our communities, protect where we live, and all the important seeds we plant, all the infrastructure we build where we live. That is going to strengthen our entire democracy. We're keeping them on the ropes. We're keeping them scrambling. And that's where we want them. So rise up, run for office, help good people run for office. If you don't know where to start, we have a wonderful Gaslit Nation action guide. It's wonderful because it's so easy. It just walks you through what to do, your heart and soul, how to get started on all of that. And since its launch, the Gaslit Nation action guide opens with a strong recommendation to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography, Stride Toward Freedom, his whole saving the world case study of how he practiced self-management skills and team management skills to lead a grassroots effort to take on actual authoritarianism in the South through the Montgomery bus boycott. So if you need a hand to hold, that is this wonderful spiritual hand to hold. And that's why we opened the Gaslit Nation Action Guide with it. So please don't despair, own your power, recognize how much power we very much have left in this country. And it's power that our fellow citizens of the earth in many parts of the world would love to have at their disposal. We have it. So use it. And remember that we're all the leaders that we need right now.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is, folks who are examining this from the perspective of law and order and the court system and so forth need to look at how the court systems work in countries like Russia, in authoritarian kleptocracies, instead of just assuming that the legal norms and protocol of the United States is either sufficient to battle this, or that we are dealing with the same type of state apparatus that we had even just 10 years ago. Like, the United States is increasingly a mafia state, and there were always elements of that. You can trace that back 100 years, and there are obviously elements of dirty money, dark money, mafia, plutocracy, partnerships with oligarchs, etc. But the rule of law has been so forthrightly abused under the Trump administration, using tactics like bribery, blackmail, death threats to public officials, direct, actions that in any normal, system of perception people would view as treason. And we're increasingly getting there. And, before I started covering the United States, I studied, authoritarian kleptocracies in the former Soviet Union. And I also served as an expert for asylum cases. I would often go to court for Uzbek refugees who'd been, baselessly accused of some sort of terrible crime in their home country of Uzbekistan, and had to flee and come here. And, they would tell me all about how the court system there worked, how, to quote one person, suspicious is the same as guilty, how, bribery and corruption and elite criminal impunity were a standard way of life. Like, look at what just happened in Kazakhstan with their protests. Listen to what the protesters are actually protesting. It is that kind of system. It is a deeply entrenched kleptocracy. It is mafia state rule. It is a country that doesn't have rights, doesn't have freedom, and doesn't have an actual justice system. Read reports from groups like International Crisis Center that go over the abuse of the court system. Like, you cannot just assume it's going to do what you want, because maybe it had in the past. Like, this is not Watergate, not in terms of the actual case itself, but also not in terms of the country that we are or the government that we just had. So much damage has been done that you need to look at this differently. And so that is my advice for all of these, actual legal scholars or fake legal scholars that are all over social media, is look at how the court system works in authoritarian states of the former Soviet Union, and see if you recognize some parallels, and see what dissidents there have to deal with, what lawyers there have to deal with, what the accused have to deal with. And then think about whether our system as it stands and this DOJ's actions as they stand now are sufficient to battle that kind of grim reality.
And on that note of nothing is normal, we're going to go into Kyrsten Sinema, who puts the sin in cinema. That's what we're calling this segment. She puts the sin in cinema. So as we mentioned, Trump had a big Nazi rally in Kyrsten Sinema's Arizona. We know it's a Nazi rally because he loves to use that sort of carnal rhetoric. We know from Ivana, his ex-wife, that Trump kept a book of Hitler's speeches by his bed, and it shows in his whole long history of Nazi rallies. In his rally, he called for Arizona's government to overturn its certification of the 2020 election, furthering his big lie, which is driving Jim Crow 2.0 laws across the country by a simple majority. Yet Sinema can't be bothered to join Democrats in bypassing the filibuster just once to ensure nationwide voting protections. At Trump's rally in Arizona, CNN showed a clip of interviews with Trump supporters praising Sinema and Manchin for obstructing the Democrats and protecting Trump's ongoing coup against our democracy, known as the Big Lie. The filibuster, as we've mentioned many times on the show, is a relic of the Confederacy and Neo-Confederacy states to block civil rights for non-white people. It took a bloody battle in the authoritarian South to overcome years of oppression, protected and furthered by the filibuster. So we had the Civil War, and then we had the Civil Rights Movement, which was peaceful grassroots organizing met with fascist authoritarian violence by local white militias and governments. That is what Sinema and Manchin are protecting, and why Trump supporters love them so much. Sinema and Manchin, traitors to our country, protecting and serving the Neo-Confederacy. In Sinema's case, let's look a bit deeper at the Karen of the Senate. Sinema rushed through graduating high school at age 16 as a valedictorian and finished college in only 2 years. That might seem super impressive, but I'm telling you, that's also somebody that isn't socializing, isn't getting to maybe have that proverbial acid trip in the desert where she gets to know herself and the vibrations of the universe. What I'm saying is that's freakish. I mean, maybe there's people who have done that and they've gone on to advance science and the arts in all sort of needed ways. But pay attention to this. We're going to get back to it later. Sinema then built a mythology around herself as she ran for office of having been homeless. This, of course, infuriated her parents, who assured it wasn't as bad as she dramatized. Sinema effectively switched parties in 2014, becoming a Dino, Democrat in name only, when she took money from the Koch-backed U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which gave her a leadership award in 2020, since their investment in her has been paying off. Sinema doesn't meet with her constituents. She apparently hasn't had a town hall in 3 years and doesn't do press interviews. What does that sound like? An authoritarian. As she openly disrespected President Biden, who was on his way to the Capitol to meet with senators about passing urgently needed voting rights laws, Sinema got ahead of him and delivered a big slap in the face to the president and our democracy, especially non-white people, most vulnerable to being denied access to the ballot. Republicans are making it as hard as possible to vote, and in Texas, they're denying applications just to register to vote under their new repressive Jim Crow laws. Sinema delivered her backstabbing speech full of white woman tears and gaslighting on the Senate floor as Biden, again, was on his way to rally Democrats for an urgently needed human rights cause. We'll play a clip of Sinema's speech now.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
So that was Central Park Karen Amy Cooper, but you get the idea of Sinema's speech. As Senate Karen gave her speech, she wore what looked like a cross. You might think this is a small detail, but Sinema has a thing for statement jewelry. She famously posted a picture of herself sipping sangria while wearing a fuck off ring. Yes, the ring actually said fuck off. During a time everyone was pressuring her to stop serving far-right billionaires and join Democrats to save our democracy. So to wear what looks like a cross, even though you're openly not a religious person and decline to be sworn in to Congress using a Bible, speaks to her campaign to gaslight the American public to soften her image as she destroys Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s hard-fought legacy to securing voting rights in America. As MLK's son, Martin Luther King III, points out, King's own granddaughter has less voting rights today than when she was born. This is decades of work of the Koch political network that Sinema profits from. Efforts to primary and replace Sinema have already started. A chief contender is Representative Ruben Gallego of Arizona, a former Marine who is ready to protect the Capitol on January 6th and has stood up to Kremlin aggression in Congress, which earned him death threats from a Russian official. Sinema is up for re-election in 2024. Rumors have been flying that Sinema is burning bridges with the Democratic Party because she plans to run for president in 2024. Given how impatiently Sinema sped through high school and college, this would fit a larger pattern of her life. In 2024, we will likely have a Glenn Youngkin type who's going to artfully walk a fine line between slick racist dog whistles and holding Trump and Bannon at arm's length, while benefiting from their grassroots support, their media disinformation machine, and other financial dark money sources and support. So I think Sinema, at the very least, could be setting herself up to run with a posh Trump type as a gaslighting unity ticket in 2024 to quote unquote bring the country together during this polarizing time. The independents Biden won in 2020 to put him over the edge in the Electoral College are not loyal to Biden or the Democratic Party. Many of them swung to Youngkin in Virginia. Sinema has made herself out to be an independent maverick in the style of John McCain, Even John McCain's idiot daughter, Meghan McCain, has called her good friend Kyrsten Sinema a maverick and interviewed her to closely tie the association between Maverick McCain and Maverick Sinema. So that's what Sinema seems to be banking on from all this attention, that she has solidified herself as the ideal candidate to win over independents in 2024, and likely as a vice president running mate for a Koch-backed posh Trump. I think that's the silver bullet the dark money, corporate-backed far right wants to knock off Biden or another Democrat in 2024. And remember, as we keep warning on this show, Americans love sparkly blondes. Blonde, shallow, wet seal clearance section, Kyrsten Sinema is just the sparkly object enough Americans in battleground states might just fall for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to think that the rumor about Sinema as a prospective presidential candidate or vice presidential candidate is true, in part because I think it was put out there by Amy Siskind, who for, I don't know, half a decade or so has been a staunch opponent of Trump. Before that, though, she was someone who, supported Sarah Palin and other very questionable female candidates purely because they're women. Like, that was the most important thing to her. And I don't think she's supporting Sinema. Amy Siskind is not, to my knowledge, supporting Sinema. But this is like the kind of framework that she thinks in, looking foremost at gender, at women. And that's, to my knowledge, where this came from. The other thing that worries me is like whether all of this debate over Sinema as a contender is meant to hide the fact that it really doesn't matter who runs if people don't have voting rights. And right now is the moment that matters. Right now, with Sinema, wanting to uphold the filibuster, doing what seems to be a one-woman job of destroying democracy, degrading all of the Black activists and Black voters who flipped this election in 2020, kind of obfuscating the failures of the Biden administration to do much on this issue, but also on all the other things that they ran on. Like, if you look at the platform for 2020, they've broken the majority of their promises. And even the one thing that most folks gave them credit for, which was the response to the pandemic and the, very quick mobilization to get, vaccines out and, what seemed to be a very different response from the Trump administration, which of course were, making bank off selling PPE and, all this horrible stuff. And of course, just encouraging everyone to get the virus. They're now doing that. They're now pursuing a let her rip strategy with Omicron, which, disabled activists and just people who are worried about those who are disabled, immunocompromised, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable to the Omicron variant. They're very worried about what the CDC is doing, what Biden is doing. So it's like Biden could, just flat out lose legitimately, which is very depressing when you think about, he's running against an apocalyptic death cult, and people may still, I don't think that they'll vote for the apocalyptic death cult over Biden. The worry is that they won't vote for two reasons. One, apathy and frustration, a feeling of like, well, I came out and I voted and I did my part and nothing happened. And so I'm staying home. And this is particularly, I think, younger voters who understandably may feel this way. And then two, and this is the really serious one, this is the one we've been warning of and that people need to get on right now, is people will want to vote even if they're mad at the Democrats and so forth, because they know that the Republicans are so much more dangerous, and then they can't, or their vote gets thrown out, as it would in Georgia or other states whose state legislatures have this new rule where they can just throw out the ballot. And then, of course, we also have to deal with the fact that if the Democrats do manage to win, the Republicans are going to claim the election illegitimate and then use violence and force. And because there's been almost no accountability from the DOJ, political violence has become increasingly streamlined and normalized. People have come to expect it. The shock that everybody felt on January 6th, where people saw with total clarity that this was an attack on our government, an attack on the Capitol, an attack on voting, an attack on democracy, that shock is no longer there. It's been filled with cynicism and agony and frustration and, so many other emotions, but shock won't be there. They fully expect dirty tricks and violence. That's a terrible position for a country to be in. You should never, ever accept this or sort of think, oh, yes, of course, that's what they do. It's one thing to expect it, as in you are anticipating a terrible event and you therefore want to do everything in your power to prevent the terrible event. That's why we talk about all this dark, awful stuff like voter suppression or coups or organized crime. We want it to end, and you can't end it unless you acknowledge it's there and you acknowledge it's a looming threat. So anyway, all that's to say is that, yes, I could see Sinema wanting to do this. I could see her wanting to be, in a position where she gains even more power and more money. And, she gets off on, performative politics, on gaslighting the public. She's reckless, she's destructive. They don't care about her as a person. And it's the systemic problems that will determine this election. They can float her, they could float Tucker Carlson, they could put all these people out there who are clearly massively unqualified in a traditional sense to have office, or even people who are technically qualified, like say Mike Pompeo, but are batshit insane and are like working with, the worst, most evil operatives in the world. He's also somebody who's a potential nominee. It's all irrelevant in a sense if we do not get voting rights for everybody. And it is so, so frustrating and heartbreaking, honestly, to see this concern still be dismissed after all this time. Like, I'm even seeing Democratic voters and people who sort of describe themselves as activists. It's always white people, always white people writing this, saying, you know what? We'll be okay because Black people didn't have voting rights between the end of the Civil War and the Voting Rights Act of 1964. And yet, Democrats still won. Like, they'll actually say that as some sort of excuse. And note the we. The we there is white people. The we there is in particular, white people of, middle class and above, people who don't have to wait in line for like 8 hours to vote, people who aren't struggling to get to the ballot box, people who are treated better by our government and by our society. Whereas, our priority should always be, look out for who is worst off, look out for who is struggling, for who's vulnerable, whose rights aren't guaranteed. Like, start there and then go up. And it's very, like I said, it's heartbreaking to see this dismissed. And, you brought up Martin Luther King's grandchildren having to fight for their voting rights again. Like, if that doesn't bring it home, that they have fewer rights, than somebody 20 years ago, 30 years ago did, a Black American of that time did. Like, it's just, I don't know. They should be far more mobilized, and people should be furious. They should be fighting with fury. And they should certainly not be attacking the good activists like LaTosha Brown and others from Georgia who are doing that hard work of fighting with fury and with strategy and with compassion for people who are disenfranchised. That's another thing that's missing. But anyway, I've been going on for a while, so go on.
I think it's important to keep in mind that Kyrsten Sinema has certainly higher aims. That explains her whole showboating routine. It wasn't enough for her to meet politely with Biden in the Senate, like Manchin does. Manchin meets with Biden and his people all the time, and then just politely, and sometimes not so politely, screws them over. But she makes a show out of it by going on the Senate floor when Biden's heading over. So who is that show for? It's clearly public statements to try to position herself for a bigger role. And I think this is somebody, like I said, who has had signs of sociopathic ambition. It's one thing, again, I want to just reiterate, to speed through college, high school and college for a greater purpose, a larger purpose. But in her case, her whole track record has been to be a chameleon, to serve, to be on the side of whichever is going to be more advantageous for her to come to power and stay in power. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that this is somebody that has larger aims than the power she currently has. And we need to shout her down. Kyrsten Sinema's brand is toxic. And no matter what she has her eyes on next, must remain toxic. And if her track record is any indication, she's going for, in her mind, to bigger and better things. It's not enough for her to be a savior for our democracy right now by doing the right thing, the urgent, needed thing of a filibuster exception to pass voting rights, to undo John Roberts' Supreme Court gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King's legacy now hangs by a thread, and that's devastating for not just our country, but of course our standing in the world. We are a declining democracy. America is ranked as a declining democracy. And if Kyrsten Sinema, toxic brand Kyrsten Sinema, who is going to incite probably as much hate as any Trump character in the 2024 election, people are going to be hounding her wherever she goes and confronting her with her crimes and her gaslighting. People have to understand that none of this is a drill. None of this is fun to report on. We wish we had happy news. We wish we were a show that was talking about the latest indictments of Trump's inner circle. We wish we were a show talking about all the exciting things that Congress was doing to protect us and how urgent it was. We wish we were a show that had more time to talk about other corners in the world that are struggling with democracy right now. But we don't have time for that because we're stuck trying to protect our own democracy and what's left of it. So just remember that we can't do this alone. We need you. And the way you refuse to abandon us and each other and yourselves too, because we can't just stick our heads in the sand, is by going to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide and doing what you can to support those essential organizations there fighting the good fight that need you. And we all need you now, and never forget that.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Oil Change International, an advocacy group supported with a generous donation from the Greta Thunberg Foundation that exposes the true costs of fossil fuels and facilitates the ongoing transition to clean energy.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Afghanistan. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. You can also subscribe on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Garland Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Garland Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Bissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Garland Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher: Jess Sauer,
Chick Quinn,
Lily Wachowski,
Megan McNerney,
Sean Rubin,
Todd S. Perlstein,
Pat,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Frank Jaquette,
Ellen McGirt,
Joe Farron,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Andrea Scalzo,
or Andrea, we don't know, Karen Heisler,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millette,
David East,
Stu,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Malsom,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Barbara Kittredge,
Matthew Womack,
Silas Frank,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kat Gillis,
Kai Gillis,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Irv Robinson,
William Barry Reeves,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Yvonne Q,
Mike Christensen,
Sandra Kalmans,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Gulstad,
Michael Wood. My eyes are watery. Michael Wooldridge.
Crimer, no criming. This always makes me laugh. I've said it so many times. I think it's all that Dora the Explorer era of my children's life. Anyway, go on.
Every time. Jason Benke.
Joe Darcy.
Ann Marshall.
Jeremy Lewis.
Joel Newman.
Trygve.
Christine M.
D.L. Singfield.
Matt Perez.
Nicole Spear.
Brian Tajudin.
Maureen Murphy.
Michelle Dash.
Abbey Road. I don't know. Is that it may be a rude name.
I don't know.
It's a cool name. It's a cool name. We're pro your name,
thrilled.
no
We're
matter what
thrilled
it
here.
is.
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen.
Victoria Olson.
Alabama.
ZW.
Jason Bainbridge.
Sarah Gray.
Mike Tripico.
Diana Gallagher.
John Ripley.
Ethan Mann.
Piet Yitzma.
David Porter.
Kate Cotton.
Kim Mellon.
Leah Campbell.
Lynn Schneider.
Jared Lombardo.
Karen Humphreys.
Eric Kaplan.
Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all so much for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.
Thank you.